Teresa Skubik for Forum Daily's Week in Review. The federal Liberals say stronger than expected revenues are giving them extra fiscal room, and they plan to put much of that money back into the economy. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne tabled the government's spring economic update today, outlining $54.5 billion in new spending since the November budget. A large portion of that comes from a temporary boost to the GST benefit announced earlier this year, aimed at helping households manage rising costs. Despite the new spending, Ottawa says last year's deficit came in at $11.5 billion lower than expected, below the $78.3 billion projected in the 2025 budget. However, the update also warns of growing uncertainty ahead, pointing to global risks, including the conflict involving Iran and ongoing U.S. tariffs. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is sharply criticizing the federal government's proposed sovereign wealth fund. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced the plan as part of a broader effort to boost long-term economic growth. The government says it will commit $25 billion to the fund, which is intended to invest in major nation-building projects in partnership with private investors and potentially individual Canadians. Poilievre argues the fund risks giving the government too much control over investment decisions and lacks transparency.
Some of the countries around the world, you will note, have sovereign wealth funds. You need to have wealth for those funds. Norway, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia run big budget surpluses, which they accumulate and then put into their sovereign wealth funds. Carney has no surplus and therefore no wealth to put in such a fund. He's talking about a sovereign debt fund. He wants to put another $25 billion on the national credit card to gamble on a Liberal slush fund that will enrich Liberal insiders at the expense of hardworking Canadians. How many corporate welfare agencies do the Trudeau-Carney Liberals need to create before they learn that it doesn't work? They have the Canada Infrastructure Fund. Remember the Infrastructure Bank? Remember that was going to invest in all these projects? What happened with that? There's a new defense industry bank. There's the Canada Growth Fund and countless other departmental agencies that Liberals have created and grown over the last decade to give us the worst investment and growth in the G7.
Meanwhile, the Liberals say the goal is to attract more capital, support large-scale infrastructure and energy projects, and strengthen Canada's position in the global economy. Meanwhile, Poilievre is also raising broader concerns about the government's economic direction, saying recent decisions by Carney are driving investment out of Canada. He argues the Liberals need to rein in the spending and cut red tape, pointing to international reporting he says underscores those concerns.
He's driving investment out of our country, and don't ask me to prove it, just read the Financial Times, which issued a damning piece on Mark Carney's economic record 1 year in. I'm quoting, Canada's leading industry groups say Prime Minister Mark Carney's efforts to cut red tape is floundering, costing the economy billions more in trade losses than President Trump's tariffs. Derek Nybor, president of the Forest Products Association, said, quote, over the past decade, overlapping government policies, mostly environmental regulations, have chilled strategic investments and become a productivity and a competitiveness killer, driving away investment. Quote, I've heard of resource projects that require hundreds of permits due to federal, provincial, and municipal governments, said David Pearce, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce Vice President of Government Relations. Dan Kelly, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business President, said the regulatory reform agenda, quote, remains stalled. Ottawa is focused on helping a few big players, while with every other unwashed business owner stuck in the old, unworkable system.
I sat down with economist Dr. Moshe Lander to break this down. Now, Pierre Poilievre has said that Canada's economic direction is concerning and that things are not getting any better. What is your view on that accusation?
He's right. Unfortunately, his solution is the wrong solution, where he says, well, I could do better, or I'd be on my way to balancing the budget. He's wrong. He wouldn't be balancing the budget. He shouldn't be balancing the budget. And I don't think that he can fix Canada's problems, certainly not within the term of one parliament. Canada's problems stem at least in part from Trump's tariffs and the disruption to trade, closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and Canada's flat to declining productivity over a period of 30 years now. So if he thinks that somehow he could do better than a professional economist, he's sadly mistaken. But hey, it's easier to snipe from the sidelines than to actually get your hands dirty and fix the problem. So I envy his position to complain without actually having to do what you say.
Now, there was recently an article in the Financial Times that outlined how domestic red tape is more of an issue for Canadian businesses than Trump's tariffs. What could or should be done to meaningfully address the red tape?
Well, that's the nature of just doing business in Canada, unfortunately. There's this trade off between efficiency and equity. So, if you want to be efficient, you want to remove all of that red tape and it's every man, woman, and child for themselves, Canada's standard of living would jump substantially. But when you pursue efficiency, it does come at the expense of equity. And so, part of what that red tape is for is not to gum up business. It's not that there's some anti business sentiment. It's that that's what keeps inequality from becoming really pronounced in Canada. And where a lot of people are feeling that there is some element of inequity within Canada, compare it to, say, the US and look at the extreme poverty, but also the extreme wealth that exists in that country. That is the trade off. And Canadians in general have thought that a little bit of equity at the expense of efficiency is worth it. I think that we're now maybe reconsidering, have we gone too far in one direction and should we swing the pendulum back the other way? But look, red tape is a problem, but it's there for a reason. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand why it's there at least.
And what about interprovincial trade barriers? Are we seeing progress on getting rid of those?
No. Um, the theory is that it was supposed to be gone, I think, last Canada Day. So now maybe there's a hope that it'll be gone by this Canada Day. The federal government, when they portrayed that they were going to lead the charge to remove those interprovincial barriers, remember, they're not a province. So they have very few interprovincial barriers that existed. And so when they said, hey, we scrapped all of ours, well, congratulations, you really weren't the culprits. To be able to convince the provinces themselves to get rid of their interprovincial barriers is extremely difficult because the provinces put them in place not to gum up trade because they wanted to harm Canada's economy, but they were looking to protect vested interests. They're really no different than Trump's tariffs, but where we're so angry and talking about elbows up and boycotting and let's take it to the Americans, we don't seem particularly concerned about going after neighboring provinces that are gumming up our local economy. And so, are we going to our political leaders and saying the same thing that we're saying to the Americans, that if you want to put tariffs on us, that's fine, but we're not going to slap ourselves in the face and hope that you feel the pain, so we're not doing it back to you? Which province wants to step forward and say, we're going to eliminate all of our interprovincial barriers, and if you want to keep them on us, you're the idiots, not us?
I also want to ask about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Critics have pointed out that funds like this are usually from budget surpluses, but Canada hasn't had a budget surplus in over a decade. Without a surplus, is a fund like this a good idea?
I don't even know if the issue is whether it's funded from a surplus or a deficit. I think it's more an issue of what type of return are you offering? And when you're asking Canadians to stump up their cash, uh, how are you going to generate the ability to repay it? If you borrow at 5% on your line of credit, but you invest it at 9%, there's nothing wrong with borrowed money. So if the government wants to finance this sovereign wealth fund with a deficit and they have to borrow to finance the deficit as a result, that's okay if you can promise me that you're going to generate greater returns with where you put that money. I think the intention of this sovereign wealth fund is for Canadian infrastructure. And so rather investing in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, crypto around the world, if it's domestically spent money, then this is very little different than government spending on infrastructure projects. Those generally don't deliver large financial returns. And whenever you're dealing with the government, over budget and over time are usually two words that come up regularly. So I fail to see how this is going to be better than actually just borrowing the money as deficit spending and using it rather than creating some sovereign wealth fund. I think it's good politics. I think it sounds good. I think it creates that illusion to Norway or even the Saudis, the UAE, and China. But I think at the end of the day, this is probably not the right time, not because of the surplus or deficit issue. It's just I'm not exactly sure why anybody would want to invest in it.
Conservative MP Jamil Javani was in Washington alongside several colleagues for meetings focused on Canada-U.S. trade. The group met with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer as well as Canadian business leaders at an event hosted by the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada. Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Mark Wiseman, was also in attendance. Back in Ottawa, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was asked what Javani hoped to accomplish during the visit.
Point of your MPs being in Washington?
I don't have any information on that, but I do at this point to share. But I can tell you that our MPs have been consistently going to Washington in order to fight for tariff-free trade. There have been, I'm guessing, about a dozen delegations of MPs over the last couple of years, and we're going to continue to fight for jobs. So what's the point? Obviously, the point is to fight for the auto workers, steel workers, aluminum workers, forestry workers, who Mark Carney has abandoned after he promised he'd have a deal by July 21st. Still no deal, still no wins. The tariffs have doubled and broadened, and Mark Carney has delivered absolutely nothing. So we're going to keep fighting for jobs.
Do you think the government of Canada should be using Mr. Giovanni's relationship with the Vice President in the context of trying to secure some kind of a deal? Do you see that relationship as beneficial?
I would just say the government should use every relationship we have as Canadians. We've proposed a Team Canada approach. When I went down to the United States, I worked very collaboratively with the Prime Minister, and I know all of our MPs are willing to do anything they can to help, because we have to put our country first, our workers first, our economy first, and that means putting party labels aside and serving the country's interests.
That same incident is now the focus of an ongoing investigation in Washington, where officials are defending the response of federal law enforcement. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche says the United States Secret Service did not fail in its response after a man armed with firearms rushed security outside a ballroom where Trump and other officials were gathered. Speaking at a news conference, Blanche defended the actions taken by law enforcement during the confrontation.
That act, that horrible act, was stopped because of the courage and professionalism of law enforcement. The officers who responded without hesitation and did their jobs as they were trained to do. Secret Service agents promptly tackled and detained the suspect, Cole Thomas Allen. The president and all the protectees and participants at the dinner were safe. One brave officer was injured and is receiving care and has been released from the hospital. But we also should recognize what did not happen. Law enforcement did not fail. They did exactly what they are trained to do. This was not an accident. It was the result, as we know now, of preparation. But the men and women who protected us that night were trained, professional, and had an enduring commitment to the rule of law.
Court documents identify the man as Cole Thomas Allen. In the aftermath, Blanche condemned rising political tensions, saying the rhetoric and violence has got to stop.
The Department of Justice approaches incidents like this with urgency and clarity of purpose. Violence has no place in civic life. It cannot and will not be used to disrupt democratic institutions or intimidate those who serve them, and it certainly cannot continue to be used against the President of the United States. Well, you just described the current threat environment pretty accurately, which is that the political violence and rhetoric has got to stop. And that's something President Trump said right after the incident on Saturday night. It's something that Carolyn Levitt talked about a couple hours ago. It is something that is, when you have a president who and many people in this room, if we're going to be honest about it, have done it as well. They're just as guilty as a lot of people on X. When you have reporters, when you have media just being overly critical and calling the president horrible names for no reason and without evidence, without proof, it shouldn't surprise us that this type of rhetoric takes place. If you look at what it appears that this defendant had in his past, we're talking about somebody who is college educated, who has a job, who is otherwise living his life, and we'll find out more about him, as I expect, in the coming days and weeks. But he chose to do what he did, and so our threat environment is we are ready. I mean, I'm not going to go through what Director Patel just talked about with the way we responded, but this was something that we will always be prepared for, and it's sad that it has to happen, but it's not a new thing, unfortunately.
I'm now joined by Andrew Donaldson, an editor at OrdinaryTimes.com, for more on the shooting. Andrew, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
Now, I want to talk about that first clip that we heard from Blanche. He's saying that the Secret Service response was effective. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, and I know the viral video looks probably worse than it was, but by the worst case scenario, by the facts we have, was this was a suspect that was stopped within seconds. That's an incredible reaction time by any standard. Now, you can argue about the video of him running through the security checkpoint, that sort of thing, but a guy coming full speed, maybe somebody should have been paying more attention, but they stopped him. The security worked. This was the outer perimeter of the protectees perimeter, and they stopped it, and the whole thing worked. What needs to be talked about on the broader sense, though, is we once again have somebody who clearly had lots of red flags that his own family, friends, and acquaintances knew could be potentially a problem, who once again fell through the cracks. And I'm sure none of them thought they was going to take a shot at the president, most of the sitting cabinet, and the entirety of the Washington press corps. But that's kind of the meta level of this whole thing is once again, we have a shooter that everybody knew was going to be a problem and nobody was able to do anything about. But the Secret Service and the agents on site, yeah, they did their job correctly here.
And what do we know about the three charges that the suspect is facing, and how serious are they?
They're as serious as it possibly gets. Attempted assassination on the president. They're going to specify these charges down further, I suspect, in the future. Of course, there's a weapons charge and other things, but yeah, this is as serious as it gets. And of course, Washington D.C. is federal ground. The federals are going to get a hold of him right off the bat. He is in a whole lot of trouble. Now we'll see how the investigation plays out. I'm sure there's going to be mental health checks and that sort of thing, but these are the most serious charges you could possibly face, and they should be.
And how significant is it that prosecutors are treating this as an attempted assassination of the president?
Well, it obviously they should. Now there you could dig into his manifesto for what it's worth, and we should always be careful with the ramblings of somebody who clearly has all sorts of issues going on. But he was very specific about certain members of the cabinet, very specific about certain members of the cabinet he was excluding, by the way, too, which was kind of interesting. So you could make an argument of that, and I'm sure his defense team will. But look, if the president's at an event, that's the headliner, and anybody that does anything violent towards an event that the president's at, you need to take it seriously as a threat to the president because he's the one everybody knows about, especially in a place where this man was tackled and detained. He's only about 70 feet from where Reagan was shot on the sidewalk side. This was inside and down the hall on the inside. History doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme. So, yeah, this needs to be taken very, very seriously.
And Todd Blanche also pointed to political rhetoric. How much of a role do you think that the current political climate plays into incidents like this, or is this just another issue of gun violence?
Multiple levels here. Everybody that has a platform, including me, including you, including the president, by the way, and all of his media and great, very powerful media outlets, everybody should do better and turn it down. However, what you also have is going to be pretty clear in the delineated biography of what we know about this particular individual. We once again have a shooter, potential shooter in this case, thank God, who marinated himself in what he already believed and found out and found ways to feed it to himself through technology and online. That's the new part to a lot of this. So yes, everybody needs to turn the rhetoric down. But no, this is yet another example of somebody who figured out how to marinate themselves in hate to the point that they made themselves violent, self-radicalize themselves. That's the new threat, and we see it over and over and over again in these incidences.
Now, we've already discussed the fact that the Secret Service did exactly what they needed to do in that situation. But what are things that the government can do to prevent this from even getting to that point?
Well, there's a top-down problem with law enforcement and mental health care in America anywhere where we don't have a good system to flag these people that are a problem ahead of time. Family doesn't want to turn them in. There's not enough mental health care for, and assuming that it's an assumption, we need to make that clear. There's not enough places to put these people except in the law enforcement system, which isn't built or equipped to handle it. That's a huge societal problem that has not been dealt with. But yeah, we need to figure out a way, especially on the online age, where these people marinate themselves online hate and turn violent. That's the piece of this we got to get better with. And nobody has a good answer for that. There's not a lot of research on that. And it gets into a lot of civil liberty laws and a lot of icky areas people don't want to talk about where does your rights stop and where does the state and society's rights start to keep everybody safe from the president down to the average citizen.
As tensions with Iran remain a key issue on the global stage, attention is also turning to long-standing alliances between Western nations. King Charles reaffirmed the deep ties between the United Kingdom and the United States, calling their long-standing alliance a special relationship.
The story of the United Kingdom and the United States is at its heart a story of reconciliation, renewal, and remarkable partnership. From the bitter divisions of 250 years ago, we forged a friendship that has grown into one of the most consequential alliances in human history. I pray with all my heart that our alliance will continue to defend our shared values with our partners in Europe and the Commonwealth and across the world. and that we ignore the clarion calls to become ever more inward-looking.
The speech marked a historic anniversary of U.S. independence, and the king also paid tribute to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, noting that she stood in that same chamber 35 years ago.
Standing here today, it is hard not to feel the weight of history on my shoulder, because the modern relationship between our two nations and our own peoples spans not merely 250 years, but over 4 centuries. It is extraordinary to think that I am the 19th in our line of sovereigns to study with daily attention the affairs of America. So I come here today with the highest respect for the United States Congress, this citadel of democracy created to represent the voice of all American people to advance sacred rights and freedoms. Speaking in this renowned chamber of debate and deliberation, I cannot help but think of my late mother, Queen Elizabeth, who in 1991 was also afforded this signal honor and similarly spoke under the watchful eye of the Statue of Freedom above us. Today, I am here on this great occasion in the life of our nations to express the highest regard and friendship of the British people to the people of the United States. Now, as you may know, when I address my own Parliament at Westminster, we still follow an age-old tradition and take a member of Parliament hostage.
2 Jewish men were stabbed on the street in London on Wednesday. Police described the attack as an act of terrorism. A 45-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of attempted murder as anti-Semitic attacks increased in England's capital city. The 2 injured men, aged 76 and 34, remain in hospital. Counter-terror police are investigating if there is a link between the recent stabbings and arson attacks on synagogues and other Jewish sites in London. We'll be right back with Forum Daily's Week in Review after these messages. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew said this weekend that Manitoba could become the first province in Canada to ban social media and potentially AI chatbots for young people. Kinew made the remarks at an NDP fundraiser in Winnipeg, as other provinces and the federal government also weigh possible restrictions on youth access to social media.
Our kids will never be for sale, and their attention and their childhoods should never be profited from. We owe the next generation of Manitobans a simple promise: freedom to be a kid and to enjoy this beautiful place that we call home. The focus of our society should be to train our next generation. It shouldn't be to train the next AI model.
Social media use among youth has been linked to a range of health concerns, including reduced sleep, attention issues, and long-term mental health impacts, though researchers say more study is needed to establish clear causes. Canada's Heritage Minister has said that the federal government is very seriously considering age-based restrictions, while lawmakers in other provinces are also exploring similar measures. But Manitoba is the first to outline a potential plan. Premier Wab Kinew did not specify what age limit the province is considering, how any ban would be enforced, or when it could take effect. He also did not take questions from reporters after his speech. I sat down with Yael Osowski, the Deputy Director of the Consumer Choice Centre, for more on Manitoba's announcement. Now, Yael, from a policy standpoint, how practical is it to actually enforce a ban on social media or AI chatbots for young people in one province opposed to the entire country?
I mean, practically speaking, it's next to impossible. This is something that you could try to do with IP addresses. It's something you could try to do realistically, with the carriers and the providers of internet services. But a lot of this, particularly across Canada, are really going to be different. And sometimes the interchanges are hosted in Montreal or Calgary or sometimes in Vancouver. So it's really next to impossible. I view this more as a move that's politically very popular, but technically and practically just not very feasible. Not something that's really going to work, but it's definitely going to give Premier Kinew a big boost, I think, domestically.
And could this kind of provincial ban conflict with federal jurisdictions or even raise legal or constitutional issues?
I think so. There's a reason that you just haven't had any of these social media bans that have been passed thus far at the provincial level. There's a lot of charter concerns. Realistically, what is the federal government's role on this? And another thing to think about is we actually technically don't even have a minimum age limit for the internet in Canada. Most of the services that are used in Canada kind of follow the American model of 13 years and over. That's from COPA. So we really don't have one yet in Canada. And I really don't see any way that you could legitimately constitutionally pass this. Again, if we're talking about the federal government, that's a whole other issue. But at least at the provincial level, technically not feasible and legalistically probably pretty dubious as well.
And we're also seeing the federal government and other provinces consider these similar restrictions. Do you see this becoming a national trend, or do you think this is just a lot of talk right now?
Well, it's definitely a lot of talk, but there's actually the French president, Emmanuel Macron, he calls it the movement. So he's very excited about the prospect of under 16 social media bans. Everyone has their own reasons for being in favor of this. Again, it's politically very popular. It's seen that's something that's very easy. But even Premier Canoe has made the point that this is not about, trying to protect children to, the nth degree. A lot of it has to do with just accountability. And he's trying to lay it all on big tech and big tech oligarchs while leaving parents completely out of the situation, while not allowing kids to experiment and use the internet like we may have when we were young. So I really don't see this becoming a large movement, so-called, that will hold up and be rigid when it comes to our own laws. But it is definitely something that people are very excited about. Everyone has angst about the internet. Everyone has angst about digital devices. It's just about how we solve that. Do we solve that in our own families, in our own homes? Or is this something that we want to try to really give the government more control? And I think more people, once they actually read the details and see how this works and see how it's failed in places like Australia, they're not necessarily going to be in favor of it.
Well, I want to talk about Australia a little bit because one of the biggest issues they've had is actually verifying age online. So how realistic is it for a province like Manitoba to actually enforce something similar? Well, we've seen Australia face challenges. Like, what could Manitoba learn from Australia?
I mean, what you can learn there is it's incredibly difficult, and you cannot do it unless you're forcing some kind of identity confirmation, some kind of digital ID. If you're having to do that with everyone who logs on or who creates an account. So you are creating that kind of issue. One thing that they did in Australia is they just forced many of the tech companies to delete all of the accounts. So it was something like 5 million accounts of people who were under 16. All of those accounts were deleted overnight. And people were able to easily route around it using VPNs, signing up using different names, different services. I think really what you can learn is you can try to come up with any kind of sort of technical explanation. You can come up with pilot programs, but realistically, this stuff is just not going to be totally enforceable. And even if we do have all of that data, there's enough history of leaks and breaches and all kinds of different bad actors out there who've gotten their hands on information related to this that we can say it's really a bad idea. So there's a lot to learn in Australia. I think everyone has this impulse of protecting children, making sure people online are not being exposed to things they shouldn't be. But again, that's the role for individuals. It's the role for parents, particularly in the household. So I think there's a lot to learn there. And hopefully, whether it be in Manitoba or Ontario or the rest of the country, they can learn that lesson too.
And Ontario is rolling out what it calls the most comprehensive plan in Canada to cut down on classroom distractions and improve students' health. The province says it's introducing standardized province-wide rules and mandatory learning measures aimed at tackling the growing concerns around cell phone use and social media.
Right now, we're reflecting on a wider ban on cell phones. I think the evidence is becoming more and more clear that cell phone use in our schools, elementary and our secondary schools, anywhere on site, has become a problem. So we are considering an outright ban of cell phones on school properties across the province of Ontario. Obviously, for health reasons, we'll allow some exemptions to that. And we are going to be working closely with the federal government with respect to a broader social media ban. Frankly, for kids under a certain age, I know the federal government is interested in that. We're reviewing what Manitoba has done. I think it's a good opportunity for us in Ontario, but it doesn't go necessarily as far as we would like it to go, but it is a good step. So we are looking at both of those, a complete cell phone ban province-wide and a social media ban for our kids under restricted access to social media for our kids under a certain age. But we're going to work with the federal government on that too, because I think most ministers of education are in agreement that it has not been a healthy. It's not healthy for our kids in our schools to have access to these, and we heard it from educators as well. So I think it's time we move on both of those.
The government is also strengthening the rules around students caught using or carrying vapes or cigarettes. Students will be required to surrender these products, along with parents being notified immediately of the situation. The federal government is committing $755 million in new sport funding as part of its spring economic update. Finance Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne says the investment is aimed at expanding access to sport across the country and strengthening support for Canadian athletes competing on the world stage.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to say this again. I was getting excited there, but I think it's important to say it again. It's the most significant investment in sports in 20 years. Yes, to give young people better access and better support for high-performance athletes with additional funding of $755 million. Canadians across the country understand the power of sport. They understand how it brings us together and how it has an impact on our communities. We saw it last year during the Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games, and we see it every day on our rinks, in our sports centres, and in our schoolyards. A Canada for all must also be a Canada where sport is accessible for everyone.
Toronto Police Service have announced a $25,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of a man wanted in a series of robberies and break-ins, including a shooting at a Toronto mall last week. Police say officers were called to CF Fairview Mall just after 10 a.m. last Tuesday following reports of gunfire. Investigators allege the suspect robbed a jewelry store before shooting and seriously injuring a security guard, then fleeing the scene.
As you know, early last week, a suspect shot and seriously injured a member of the security team at Fairview Mall after committing a robbery at a jewelry store. The victim was met with violence for simply doing his job. Our thoughts remain with him and his family and friends as he continues to recover. Later that day, the hold-up squad identified the suspect as 53-year-old Kyle Douglas Prowse of Montreal. Since last week, investigators have been working around the clock to locate this individual. What we confirm today is that this is not an isolated incident. We believe that Prowse is responsible for at least 6 separate robberies and break-and-enters at banks and jewelry stores across Ontario and Quebec, dating back to 2023. This is an individual who has demonstrated a pattern of escalating and dangerous behavior. We are concerned about the risk he poses to public safety, and we are asking for the public's help to locate him. The suspect is described as a white male between 5'6" and 5'8" tall. We have released images and video of the suspect spanning a 3-year period, and we are urging anyone who recognizes him or has information about his whereabouts to come forward.
And children in the United Kingdom who are 17 and under and anyone born in the future will never be able to legally buy cigarettes under new legislation passed by lawmakers. The measure, known as the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, sets a permanent smoking ban for anyone born after December 31st, 2008. Once it receives royal assent, the law will also introduce tighter restrictions on vaping. That includes banning the sale of vaping and nicotine products to anyone under 18. Our contributor, Andrew Thompson, sat down with Dr. Abhishek Raut, a medical director at Appletree Medical Group, for more on the UK's new ban.
Dr. Raut, first of all, thank you for taking the time to join me today. This is a really important topic and really pleased to get to sit down and talk with you about this.
Pleasure to be here.
So for our viewers who may just be hearing about this, can you explain what the UK's new Tobacco and Vapes Bill actually does and why it's being called a landmark moment in health?
Oh, that's a wonderful place to start, because this is really one of those rare moments in medicine and public policy where we can say something genuinely historic has just happened. So the UK Parliament has cleared a landmark piece of legislation, which is basically creating a smoke-free generation. So in really plain terms, if you were born in 2009 or later, so anyone who's 17 or younger right now, you will never at any point in your life be legally permitted to buy a cigarette in the United Kingdom. Not when you're 18, not when you're 40, not ever. So this isn't a minimum age restriction in a very traditional sense, which is what we've done before. This is a generational prohibition. So it's not tied to a fixed date at all. So what we are seeing in this case is that this legislation is going to grant certain ministries enhanced powers as well to strengthen existing legislations as well, and things like smoking in public spaces as well. But from a physician's perspective, what we understand here is this is a truly large scale. So governments have been warning people about the dangers of tobacco since the 1960s. We've had taxes, we've had age restrictions, we've had warning labels, we've had advertising bans, all very important steps. But this is the first time a major world power has said this generation will simply not be eligible. So it's a structural intervention, not just an educational one. And that's very significant.
How serious is smoking as a public health issue in the UK right now and around the world that such a dramatic law was felt to be necessary here?
I think that's a great question. And sometimes when we do talk about policy, we lose sight of that human reality behind a number. So we should bring that back and see. So smoking still remains the leading cause of preventable death in the UK, about 74,600 to about 78,000 deaths a year. So these are not deaths from unavoidable diseases or rare genetic conditions. These are deaths that are a direct product, a product of this product, which is legal, widely sold, and deeply addictive. So the full toll of tobacco on the nation, and this we're just talking about the UK, is about 400,000 hospital admissions, 6,400 deaths attributed each year in England alone. But the burden goes far beyond that. We're talking about lost economic productivity, associated health and social care costs, which add up to about 43.7 billion pounds, or about 59 billion for us. And factoring in the cost of just smoking-related early deaths, that goes up to 100 billion. So when we see people who are in their 50s, they're struggling to breathe, they're tethered towards an oxygen tank, they're not able to walk up a flight of stairs, that is the everyday reality of many tobacco-related chronic pulmonary obstructive disease patients. And when we see these 45-year-olds, very young, with lung cancer who started smoking as a teenager, that is the downstream consequences of a habit that began in adolescence. So these laws are here to protect those people from breaking that entire cycle and basically starting with a new generation of smoke-free habits.
This legislation also covers vaping and nicotine products, not just cigarettes. What should people understand about vaping and why it's included in this bill?
I think this is interesting because even in clinical practice and in conversations with worried parents as well, vaping has this somewhat nuanced, complicated reputation, and for good reason. The picture is nuanced. So let's be clear on what we do know. Vaping was originally promoted as a harm reduction tool, a way to help adult smokers transition away from combustible cigarettes, which is unquestionably more damaging. However, what has happened over time is that vaping has become a massive problem among young people who were never smokers in the first place. So now we are seeing an entire generation who have become nicotine dependent through vaping, particularly through what we see as brightly colored, fruit-flavored products that are quite transparently marketed towards younger people. So nicotine addiction here in a developing brain is not really a trivial concern. It affects concentration, it affects mood regulation, impulse control, and research does show that people who are more likely to vape when they're young are more likely to try conventional cigarettes. So again, a very nuanced, complicated picture, but it does make sense that in this case, this law would also apply to vaping to just stop that issue from ever happening. And so from a pediatric and adolescent standpoint as well, the direction of this legislation is absolutely the right one.
What is the draw, you think, for youth to start vaping potentially? I mean, is it the cool thing to do? Is it the flavor? I mean, what is the biggest draw for youth to try it?
I think it's a very complicated picture. I think part of that is certainly that appeal that is present, but I think there's also role modeling that exists as well, with previous generations smoking and you not necessarily being able to access that, but still wanting to model what mom and dad do. Vaping becomes this way to kind of do that and also feel more like an adult, but at the same time still be able to have access to these things. So it starts off there, but certainly can expand to other areas as well.
Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand says it's her understanding that several Iranian soccer officials had their permission to enter Canada revoked ahead of the FIFA Congress in Vancouver. According to Iranian state media, that includes the Iranian Football Federation president, along with 2 other officials who were denied entry. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand was asked about details on this decision.
It's not my personal lead, but my understanding is that there is a revocation of the permission. It was unintentional, but I'll leave it to the minister to indicate. I'll say that on our position on Iran, it is clear from a diplomatic standpoint. We have no diplomatic relationships with Iran. We have not had diplomatic relationships with Iran for over 10 years. We have listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity in this country. We have levied hundreds of sanctions against the Iranian regime, and we will continue to stand with the people of Iran whose rights have been repressed. But on your specific question, I'll leave it to the minister to respond to.
The situation is also drawing political reaction. Conservative immigration critic Michelle Rempel-Garner says she's concerned he may have initially been allowed into the country, pointing to his past as a commander of the IRGC.
I'm really concerned about the fact that a man named Mehdi Taj, who was once a commander in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, somehow made it to Canada, which means that he would have been issued a temporary resident permit by the government. So I'm really concerned about this because, as my colleagues and I have been raising for several weeks now, we know that there have been IRGC officials that have slipped through the cracks. So clearly there's a screening problem with the government.
There's a new king at the box office, and it's Michael. The Lionsgate biopic about the king of pop, Michael Jackson, has made a massive entrance, pulling in $97 million domestically and an impressive $217 million worldwide in its opening weekend. That makes it the biggest debut ever for a biopic, blowing past the previous record set by Straight Outta Compton, which opened to $60 million back in 2015. For some perspective, Bohemian Rhapsody debuted with $51 million in 2018 before going on to earn over $900 million globally. And so far this year, Michael ranks as the second biggest opening, just behind April's The Super Mario Galaxy movie, which debuted with $131 million. Buffalo hockey fans stepped up in a big way on Tuesday night. During the pregame anthem at the Buffalo Sabres game, technical issues cut out much of the singer's microphone during O Canada. What could have been an awkward moment quickly turned into something memorable. Fans inside the arena, just miles from the Canadian border, joined in. It turned into a powerful show of unity from the crowd, helping the singer finish the anthem without missing a beat.
Oh, Canada, our home and native. Hatred, love, and with glowing we see a truth strong and from far and wide, oh, can and on God. Glory.
I'm Teresa Skubik, and thanks for joining us once again on Forum Daily's Week in Review. Have a great weekend, Canada.